Good morning. This is Environmental Intelligence Episode 16 for March 27th, 2026, your daily environmental intelligence briefing. It's Friday, so let's cut through the noise and cover what actually matters before the weekend. Alberta First Nations and farmers are formally demanding a full federal impact assessment under the IAA for a proposed carbon capture and storage pipeline project to the West Coast. The request is significant because it directly challenges what has become a recurring pattern in Canadian linear infrastructure approvals. Alberta stakeholders, including both Indigenous communities and agricultural operators whose lands the pipeline would cross, argue that federal and provincial authorities appear intent on segmenting the project to rely on narrower provincial reviews under Alberta's Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act rather than triggering the full federal process. They point to the scale of the undertaking. A multi-hundred-kilometer pipeline transporting captured CO2 from oil sands operations, and the potential for serious cumulative effects on watersheds, wildlife corridors, and traditional territories that have already experienced decades of industrial development. Previous similar projects have sometimes seen individual segments excluded from comprehensive IAA scoping, allowing proponents to avoid deeper baseline studies and broader consultation obligations. What stands out to me is how explicitly these groups are calling out the segmentation tactic before the project even reaches formal designation. For consultants and counsel supporting either proponents or interveners on CCS or pipeline work in Alberta, this file just raised the stakes on scoping memos. You should expect expanded requirements around cumulative effects assessment, deeper Indigenous knowledge integration, and more rigorous justification for why certain project components might or might not be considered designated under the IAA. The outcome here will likely shape how regulators interpret cumulative effects for oil sands-related carbon transport infrastructure across Western Canada for the next several years. This Alberta story connects directly to ongoing coordination challenges between federal and provincial governments that are playing out in Northern Ontario. An interim report prepared jointly by participating First Nations and the Federal Impact Assessment Agency of Canada on the Ring of Fire mining region reveals that Ontario chose not to participate in the federal assessment process. This absence is more than procedural. It creates material gaps in provincial input on mining development, supporting infrastructure, and the assessment of cumulative effects that would ordinarily be addressed through coordinated federal-provincial review under both the Impact Assessment Act and Ontario's Environmental Assessment Act. The Ring of Fire remains one of the most complex undeveloped mineral districts in Canada, with overlapping interests in chromite, nickel, and other critical minerals set against sensitive peatland ecosystems and established Indigenous homelands. Without Ontario at the table, ABLE, federal baseline data collection, effects pathways analysis, and proposed mitigation measures may advance without the benefit of provincial data sets and regulatory perspectives that practitioners normally rely upon. For those managing mining projects, contaminated sites, or linear infrastructure in the Ring of Fire and surrounding areas, this increases the risk of downstream regulatory conflict, additional federal conditions, or challenges during permitting under the Fisheries Act or Species at Risk Act. The practical takeaway is clear. Review your active and prospective files in the region this week. Identify where your work assumes seamless provincial data alignment and begin flagging potential gaps created by this non-participation. Early recognition of these coordination fractures allows you to adjust consultation strategies and technical work plans before disputes crystallize. While those federal-provincial tensions continue in Ontario, British Columbia is making its own institutional changes that will ripple through environmental permitting and remediation work. The province has disbanded its dedicated climate agency, reassigning staff to pipeline-related regulatory files. This reorganization affects institutional capacity for delivering the Clean BC program and implementing climate policy that increasingly intersects with Environmental Management Act, permitting and contaminated sites remediation under the BC Contaminated Sites Regulation. Climate considerations are no longer peripheral. They are becoming embedded in Schedule 2 risk assessments, remediation plan approvals, and EMA amendment applications, particularly where adaptation measures or greenhouse gas reduction commitments form part of the approval conditions. Consultants and QPs with active CSR files or ongoing EMA authorizations should track whether this shift reduces review capacity for climate adaptation components in remediation plans or human health and ecological risk assessments. The move reflects broader provincial priorities around resource development and pipeline regulation, but it creates near-term uncertainty for proponents who had been building climate resilience elements into their work. In my view, this is another example of how quickly institutional arrangements can change and why environmental professionals need to maintain current intelligence on capacity and priorities within each jurisdiction. Update your proposal templates and client briefings for BC projects to reflect the possibility of longer review timelines or reduced guidance on climate-integrated remediation, shifting from regulatory machinery to technical developments that may influence your ecological risk and offsetting work. Researchers have now engineered yeast capable of producing pollen-equivalent nutrients that, in controlled trials, increased honeybee colony reproduction rates by up to 15 times. While this breakthrough is not directly tied to contaminated sites practice, it speaks to the growing challenge of nutritional stress on pollinators caused by agricultural intensification, habitat fragmentation, and climate pressures, stressors that are often amplified on remediated or redeveloping industrial lands. For environmental professionals conducting ecological risk assessments or developing Species at Risk Act, offsetting plans for pollinator habitat on remediation sites, this work opens the door to supplemental feeding protocols as a pragmatic interim measure where natural forage is limited by residual contaminants, soil conditions, or surrounding land use. It is the kind of innovative tool that could diably appear in the next iteration of your habitat offsetting or compensation plans, particularly where regulators are pressing for measurable improvements in pollinator metrics. The science is still emerging, but the potential to bridge nutritional gaps while longer-term habitat restoration takes hold is worth understanding. Keep an eye on how this and similar biotechnological approaches to ecological support are received by regulators and Indigenous communities as they appear in future project applications. Another technical opportunity is hiding in plain sight across the Great Lakes region. Waste heat from sewers, data centers, and power plants is still largely unrecovered, despite its clear potential to reduce energy costs and lower greenhouse gas emissions in one of North America's fastest-growing urban corridors. For environmental professionals supporting brownfield redevelopment, industrial site closure, or district energy projects, this represents a genuine integration opportunity. Incorporating waste heat recovery into remedial designs and planning approvals can strengthen your case under Ontario's Environmental Protection Act and, where applicable, the Federal Impact Assessment Act by demonstrating meaningful contributions to both local energy efficiency and climate objectives. The engineering is proven. The regulatory pathway is feasible. But requires early consideration during feasibility and baseline stages. In practice, this means expanding your multidisciplinary teams earlier in the project lifecycle to include thermal energy specialists and ensuring that heat recovery options are evaluated and documented as part of the overall sustainability narrative. Sites that successfully integrate these systems often see improved community and regulatory support, which can translate into smoother approvals and better social license. On the industry side, Google's advancement of a major carbon capture pilot at a Nebraska data center offers practical insight into large-scale deployment challenges that parallel Canadian CCS ambitions. The technical performance data emerging from this project, particularly around integration with existing industrial processes, energy penalties, and operational reliability, will be closely watched by Canadian practitioners developing oil sands or industrial CCS proposals in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Those working under Alberta's Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act and federal CPA requirements should monitor the pilot's outcomes for direct implications on feasibility studies, technology selection, and the level of detail required in regulatory submissions. Real-world pilot results tend to carry more weight with regulators than theoretical modeling, particularly when projects face public and Indigenous scrutiny over long-term performance. All of these stories ultimately circle back to the persistent challenge of properly addressing cumulative effects in linear infrastructure. Consider a proposed pipeline route crossing multiple watersheds in northern Alberta, where decades of oil sands activity have already fundamentally altered baseline conditions. The proponent's draft IAA application presents each water crossing and habitat patch as discrete elements, yet any experienced regulator immediately flags the cumulative effects on fish populations, migratory birds, and water quality under both the Fisheries Act and Species at Risk Act. In the field, it becomes obvious that the real issue is not individual valve sites or compressor stations, but the progressive fragmentation of the landscape and the compounding contaminant loading over time. Existing regional monitoring data already demonstrate that some defects exceed CCME water quality guidelines across the corridor. The most effective practitioners pull historical spill records, legacy EPEA remediation files, and provincial state of the environment datasets before the first public meeting. They understand the critical nuance of distinguishing project-specific incremental loading from the regional trend that is already documented. The most common mistake remains treating cumulative effects as a late-stage appendix rather than embedding quantitative pathway analysis using CCME Tier 2 risk assessment methods from the initial study design. The practical fix is straightforward. Commission a regional data gap analysis and conduct pre-engagement with affected First Nations on shared monitoring indicators well before submitting the initial project description. This approach reduces the likelihood of regulatory pushback and demonstrates credible respect for both science and Indigenous knowledge. Before we close, here are your immediate action items. Review the Alberta to carbon capture pipeline proposal and determine whether your current or prospective CCS or pipeline projects require updated IAA scoping advice. Check active Ring of Fire files for any reliance on Ontario provincial data and flag potential gaps created by the province's non-participation. Update proposal templates for BC, EMA, and CSR projects to reflect possible reduced climate policy capacity following the Clean BC agency changes. Evaluate whether waste heat recovery options should be added to feasibility studies for industrial or data center sites in the Great Lakes Basin under Ontario EPA approvals. Ongoing public and stakeholder comment opportunities on the Alberta Carbon Capture Project environmental assessment scoping continue with no fixed close date published. Continued federal First Nations work on the Ring of Fire interim assessment carries potential for additional consultation rounds in coming weeks. Monitor for any BC government announcements on revised Clean BC implementation timelines. Track Federal Impact Assessment Agency notices for new designated project guidance that may affect linear infrastructure reviews in Alberta and Ontario. Before we wrap, watch for any early federal response to the Alberta CCS scoping requeue. US. It could set the tone for several queued oil sands transport projects that covers today's environmental intelligence. If you found this useful, share it with a colleague who needs to stay current. We're back tomorrow morning. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.